genocide in Syria. So there's a large population of Kurds inside Turkey, but Turkey sees the Kurdish population across the border in Afrin, Syria, northwest, the northwest enclave, majority Kurdish, as a threat to his national security. I just want to begin discussing a little bit about Afrin, and then we'll get to the actors. So Afrin is, as I mentioned earlier, is situated in northwest Syria. It's one of three Kurdish-controlled cantons or enclaves. The others are Jazeera and Kobani. Now, Kobani was a hotspot in 2014 when Erdogan's military did not react as ISIS attempted to take over the Kurdish region there as well. Now he realizes that in Kobani, ISIS failed to take over. He's trying to do the same, but this time with his own forces in Afrin. Now, Afrin has about 1.2 million civilians inside Afrin, the population. This is a majority Kurdish population, and there are Arabs, Armenians, Kurdish Yazidis. The Yazidis are a distinct group now because most of them fled ISIS in Iraq from Sinjar Mountain in Shingal, Kurds call it. And now they're faced with this brutal regime of Erdogan, no different than ISIS. There are also Muslims, Christians, and other religious minorities there. There are about 400,000 internally displaced civilians inside Afrin alone. These civilians fled from the Syrian dictator, Bashar Assad, since 2011, and also from the Islamic State, from nearby cities of Aleppo and Idlib. And the United Nations just recently announced that since the start of this campaign against Afrin, which started January 20th, this is the 10th day now, that there have been 5,000 internally displaced people in Afrin alone. Now, Afrin is an agricultural hub. It's been a safe haven due to the security the Kurds have been providing. They've experienced 2 rounds of elections since 2014. Actually, these elections happened recently, just this past year. They've built schools, hospitals. They've provided basic necessities and for the civilian population. And the actors inside Afrin are led by both men and women. They've provided a system of government that is inclusive and that is pluralistic, something that is not offered in in the rest of Syria. The actors, I just want to make clear who's involved in the Afrin campaign. The main forces are the indigenous Kurdish forces of Afrin, which is the YPG and the YPJ. The YPJ is the women's element of that force, and it stands for the People's Protection Unit. And this same force in Afrin is the same exact force in the other regions of where Kurds control the areas in northern Syria, who are aligned with the United States military. And yet they're organized under the Syrian Democratic Forces on the east of the Euphrates. Here they're solely the YPG and YPJ. Now, it's these forces against the Turkish military, which is the second largest military in NATO, the Free Syrian Army, or the so-called Free Syrian Army, who are no longer fighting for Syria, but are pushing Erdogan's agenda to ethnically cleanse the Kurds from Afrin. Al-Qaeda affiliates, U.S. designated terrorists, some of them are Chechens, Russia, which gave Erdogan the green light to invade into Afrin, and of course the Assad regime, which turns blindly against all this. The Turkish reason for attacking Afrin, I believe, is not legitimate, but his reasons are that obviously similar to what happened in the Iraqi Kurdish region when they called for a referendum and they went with it. It's the fear of their own Kurds inside their population calling for an autonomous region, similar to what the Kurds have in Iraq under the Kurdistan Regional Government that was implemented in '91, and also what the Kurds in Syria are creating in the north with the help of the United States. Turkey accuses of the YPG and the YPJ that they are linked to the Kurdistan Workers' Party, a unfortunately designated terrorist organization inside Turkey, not only by Turkey but by the United States and the European Union. Now, the YPG and the YPJ have publicly stated that they have no linkage with the PKK, that the PKK is a Turkish problem, and that Turkey must solve it through a political process and a peace process, not through war. But Turkey has ignored this dialogue. Turkey also accuses YPG of firing into Turkey. Now, Turkey have always accused YPG of firing into Turkey ever since they were able to create a stabilized region in the north. This is to provoke a campaign in order to bring this invasion forward. That Turkey realized that the YPG knows its tactics, using the PKK argument, using the aggression argument, that it failed. Now it has taken this invasion into its own hands. Now Erdogan's also saying that they are fighting ISIS. However, there is absolutely no ISIS in Afrin. There has never been ISIS in Afrin. This is why Afrin has been a safe haven for these internally displaced people, and it has been relatively stable throughout even long before ISIS, throughout the Syrian civil war since 2011. Another major reason that Erdogan is pushing forward with this attack is, in recent news, the United States made a statement saying that they are training a 30,000 strong border force near the Euphrates Valley to protect the borders between Iraq and Syria, and to keep this region stabilized, and to prevent a future ISIS from growing again. Now, this is a false statement. The United States is not creating a new force. These forces are the same forces that have been fighting along the U.S. since the fight against ISIS, and these are the same forces that have always been there defending themselves against the Assad regime since 2011. These are the YPG, YPJ forces, majority Kurdish, but there are Arabs, there's Turkmens, there are even Turkmens inside the YPG, YPJ, and these are all organized under the Syrian Democratic Forces, which the United States recognizes as an ally and not as a foe, which Turkey continues to link with the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, inside Turkey. Now, the Turkish agenda. Why is Turkey attacking Afrin? This is beyond, in my opinion, what Turkey is doing is not about Afrin. This is deeper and goes back in history. It's much deeper than Afrin. It's a deep historical hatred towards the Kurds since the creation of the Turkish state in 1923. There has been countless genocides against the Kurdish people inside Turkey, from Dersim and on. This is aside from the genocide that Turkey has committed against 1.5 million Christian Armenians in the 1915s. This is one of the reasons, and it hasn't been able to peacefully resolve this issue inside Turkey, which led to the creation of the PKK. We have to ask ourselves, why does the PKK exist inside Turkey? If Kurds felt safe, if Kurds felt secure, if Kurds felt included within the Turkish society, there's no reason to pick up arms. However, Turkey has raised villages, has attempted to Turkify the Kurds, and they call them mountain Turks and not Kurds. They attempted to erase the Kurdish culture, language, clothing, and language in history as well. Another Turkish agenda is that Turkey is deeply connected with the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is a threat not only to the region, but to many states, to the United States, European Union, and many states in the area as well, especially such as Egypt. Turkey has called upon, and Turkey has provided a safe haven for Hamas as well. multiple times, and they've invited Hamas officials to Turkey to discuss issues against Israeli interests. Turkey has also called for a jihad. Inside Turkey, there are over 90,000 mosques inside Turkey alone, and they've picked up a verse inside the Quran, which is the verse of conquest. This verse, they've used this throughout the mosque, throughout their Erdogan mouthpiece medias, and through sports clubs and singers and actors, celebrities, to recite this particular verse, the verse of conquest, against the Kurds. So it's a jihad. Erdogan has officially called for a jihad against the Kurds. Now, this is the Kurds in Afrin. But for Afrin, it's not only Kurdish region. Although it is majority Kurdish, it is a very diverse region. As I said before, it's a safe haven for Arabs. It's a safe haven for even Turkmens. It's a safe haven for Yazidis and other minorities. There are churches and mosques there. There have been cases where we've discussed with Syrian officials that a lot of Muslims have converted to Christianity with no fear, and they haven't received any retaliation from the Kurdish authorities there, because this is not taboo within the Kurdish culture. And Erdogan is afraid of this pluralistic model that the Kurds have provided, because they fear a demanding of such a government of system inside with the Kurds inside Turkey, and also because he's pushing a authoritarian dictatorship style government inside his country. If there's a democracy just right over the border, this is a threat to his power. Another Turkish agenda into invading Afrin is annexation. If we look back at Turkey's history, Turkey has never, if they ever invade a country, or if they ever go into a region that is beyond their sovereign territories, they usually do not pull back. And we see this with Cyprus, the issue of Cyprus. It is also a NATO ally. Despite this, the international community has been silenced. They have not discussed this issue. It has not been in the media. And this northern Cyprus has been occupied by Turkey since 1974. Yet Erdogan has cleansed the Cypriot population in the north, has put in Turks in there, and has pushed back the indigenous population that belongs there. And it's most likely same thing is going to happen in Afrin. Erdogan has threatened to ethnically cleanse publicly, to ethnically cleanse the Kurds, push out the Kurds, replace them with Turkmens, and if that doesn't work, he has threatened to flood Afrin with Syrian refugees. Since the start of the Syrian civil war, there's been 3.5 million, about 3.5 million Syrian refugees in Turkey. Now, he used the same tactic against the European Union and against Germany. He threatened to flood the gates of Europe during the refugee crisis in 2015 and 2016 if he does not receive billions of dollars annually, or if Germany does not do weapon sales with Turkey, for example. So this is also a threat to Kurdish territory. Another agenda is the expansion. So Turkey aims to expand beyond Afrin. Afrin is just the starting point. So he's threatened to, right across from Afrin is another Kurdish enclave. The nearest city is Manbij. Manbij is very strategic because Kurds were not able to connect Afrin and Manbij. So Afrin was seen as, the reason why it's being attacked is because it's seen as the weakest point as far as the Kurdish held territories, because it is isolated from the rest of where the Kurds forces are, and it has no U.S. presence in Afrin. The airspace, if I didn't mention earlier, the airspace is controlled by Russia, and Russia has given the green light. So Turkey works with Russia. They got the green light from Russia. They allowed the permission to use the airspace, and which is why it's able to conduct this air bombardment and ground invasion. So another strategic point is the expansion, because Erdogan has threatened to go into Manbij, where there's a U.S. presence and a U.S. Military forces, advisories, and also outposts there. This is a threat to a NATO ally. United States is a NATO ally with Turkey, and the U.S. has responded by saying we will not leave Afrin. And I believe it was General Mattis who was asked a question, and he responded by saying, "What if Turkey attacks U.S. soldiers?" Because this may be the case. General Mattis responded by saying that our soldiers know how to defend themselves. So that was a very strong response and appropriate response to the Turkish threat in Manbij. But Turkey wishes to go beyond Manbij. They have vowed, and Erdogan has vowed, that they will go up until the border of Iraq. And up until the border of Iraq is the Euphrates Valley, the Euphrates River, which flows through Iraq. And who controls that area is the Kurds, organized under the Syrian Democratic Forces with the YPG and YPJ forces that's aligned with the United States. There are over 2,000 U.S. soldiers that are stationed there, and there are many military outposts as well. So Erdogan attempts to eradicate the Kurdish presence there. He attempts to expand Turkish land into Syria, and also there's a lot of resources along the Euphrates Valley as far as agriculture, oil, and gas. And of course, if he does go through with this, or if he continues with this rhetoric, Iraq will also respond as well. And actually, just recently, Abadi, the Prime Minister of Iraq, Haider Abadi, responded to Turkey's attacks in Afrin, saying that it's funny how Turkey acts. He pushes for a Kurdish referendum and a stronger Kurdish ties in Iraq, but he doesn't give Kurds right in Turkey, in his own Kurdish, for his own Kurdish population. And I think this has been the policy of these states that are surrounding Kurdistan and the greater Kurdistan region against the Kurds, is the divide and conquer policy. Is that Turkey will support the Iraqi Kurds, but he will support his own Kurdish population and push forward a peaceful dialogue. The likely outcomes, I just want to give a likely scenarios of if what happens in Afrin. Now, today is the 10th day of the invasion by Turkey into Afrin. There, as I've mentioned, there are 400,000 internally displaced peoples, 5,000 new IDPs that have been created because of the aggression by Turkey. So the likely outcome is that it'll create another humanitarian crisis, in addition to half of Syria's population suffering from the almost 8-year-long Syrian civil war. This will give birth to two new terrorist organizations. Organizations similar to ISIS, maybe even worse, because it takes away from the stability that the Kurds have created. This will also prolong the Syrian civil war. International community and the powers are discussing peace process and an end to the Syrian civil war. However, Turkey just opened a new front. So my question to that is, how is a peace process and a solution possible if there's a new front in northwest Syria? And everyone is silent, unfortunately. As I mentioned before, another outcome is the ethnic cleansing of Kurds. The Kurdish population will most likely be pushed back out of Afrin, be forced into the other regions where they are controlling other territories in Manbij and east of the Euphrates, where Kurds are. Another outcome, as I mentioned earlier, is the Turkish expansion and also threat to U.S. forces. Now, the response from the international community has been very weak, unfortunately. The U.S. response has been very weak compared to, for example, say, Egypt. U.S. has always stated that they will continue to support the Kurdish forces east of the Euphrates. This includes Manbij right across, not too far from Afrin. But they've kind of turned a blind eye. This administration has reacted slowly to Erdogan's aggression, and they've turned a blind eye and has said words such as, "Oh, we understand Turkey's security concerns, although there's no security concern from Afrin into Turkey. Afrinis and Kurds and the YPG forces have never provoked or attacked Turkish territory, even the nearest city, Kilis." Russia has also, Kurds feel betrayed not so much by the United States. They expect a U.S. response because the United States is an ally of Turkey and a NATO ally as well. So they automatically, Kurds expect a U.S. response. However, that has not happened. Now, Kurds feel betrayed by Russia because since there was no U.S. presence, the Kurds had no choice but to rely on the next power inside Syria, and that is Russia. In Afrin, Russia gave the green light. Before the invasion of Afrin, Syrian Assad officials and in partnership with Putin and the Russian government, they called for a deal with the Kurds in Afrin. So the deal was, we won't allow Turkey to invade Afrin if you allow Assad forces and Assad to control Afrin. Now the Kurds said no, because this fulfills the agenda of the Assad regime. It gives more territory back to the Assad regime, and it legitimizes the Assad regime. The Kurds denied this. As soon as the Kurds denied this, Russia gave the green light to Turkey to use the airspace. This invasion would not have been possible without Russia's giving permission to Turkey, because the only advantage, I would say, despite being the second largest military in NATO, the only advantage that Turkey has over the Kurdish forces is the air power. Because when you compare the two military powers, right, the Kurds are smaller, have much less weaponry, heavy weapons than the Turks, but the Kurds are battle hardened, and they're fighting for their historical territories, rather than Turks, who are not battle hardened and are using Al-Qaeda affiliates to fight the war for them on the front lines, and also using Free Syrian Army, which have failed throughout defeating ISIS. It was the Kurds who defeated ISIS, not Turkey, not Assad, not Russia. It was the Kurds who defeated ISIS in alliance with the United States. This has to be clear, and the international community has to recognize this. So Russia gave the green light as soon as the Kurds denied Assad regime to control the territory. Iran has also spoken against the Iranian response, spoken against Turkish expansion, because Iran and Turkey have always had a competition who will lead, aside from the Saudi-Iranian battle, the Sunni-Shiite issue. Iran has always had a rift against Turkey, because they see themselves as comparable militaries and comparable powers in the region. Iran fears that Turkey, and it will also push back Iran's agenda of continuing that land bridge through the northern region of Iraq and down south too, because if there's a Turkish presence there, it complicates the original plan. Egypt spoke out against, Sisi spoke out against the Turkish invasion of Afrin, not because of the Kurds, but because of the expansion of the Muslim Brotherhood ideology and the jihadism ideology that Erdogan is pushing. Now, Erdogan says, I just want to get into the topic of Erdogan's reasoning, that he says that the Kurds are terrorists, that the Kurds are linked to the PKK, that Kurds are hurting Turkey's national interests and threatening Turkey's borders. Before this talk, I just quickly Googled, the definition of terrorism, whatever comes up in Google, and it stated that the unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians in the pursuit of political aims. Now, if we compare the two, Turkey is killing civilians, bombing refugee camps, They aided ISIS since 2014. And keep in mind that Turkey was also in a strong relationship with Assad regime before the Syrian civil war. After he realized, oh, Assad might go down, I should rethink my plans. Erdogan multiple times called Assad his brother. The Turkey aided ISIS, turned a blind eye to ISIS, used ISIS's territory to steal and sell and take Syrian oil on the black market, and Russia proved this when the Russian jet was shot down. They've aligned with Al-Qaeda affiliate groups, the Free Syrian Army. They threatened EU with flooding refugees. Turkey has called for jihad against Kurds. They're bombing hospitals in Afrin, ambulances, schools, farms. They're calling for ethnic cleansing, in essence, and all with a political intent. Is this not the definition of terrorism? Is this not what Turkey is doing? What have the Kurds done? The Kurds have provided a stable and secure territory for IDPs and refugees, Yazidi refugees and Syrian IDPs. Kurds have provided 2 rounds of elections, successful elections, and the 3rd round was delayed largely because of the continuous threat from Turkey. Kurds have provided, they've built roads, they've built hospitals, they've built schools, they've started agriculture, businesses, and this is very different from the picture that Erdogan portrays, the Erdogan's media portrays, and Turkish apologists portray. And it's time for the international community to really back the Kurds, because the Kurds have done their part. They've protected not only Syria, not only Syrian civilians, but they've also protected Turkey against a flood of ISIS and ISIS expansion in 2014. They've protected the European Union. The European Union and the Western Europe would have far more numbers of refugees if it wasn't for the Kurds who stopped ISIS right at their right where in Raqqa. And remember, it was the Kurds, it was the YPG forces and the YPJ forces organized under the SDF who took over ISIS capital in Syria, who retook it. The Kurdish message is that if we look back in history with the Jews, they suffered from Hitler. Today in 2018, Erdogan is our Hitler. Erdogan is what Kurds are suffering from. It's not, Afrin is just a small drop in the bucket, if you will, in history against from Turkish aggression. This is far bigger than Afrin. This is a situation that Turkey continues and tries to ignore from attaining a peaceful solution with its own 20 million population of Kurds inside Turkey. And if the Kurds have no choice, they'll continue to resist. The Kurds are survivors. They survived the Ottoman Empire. They survived the Islamic regime. They survived Saddam Hussein. They survived both Hafiz and Bashar Assad's powers. Another suggestion I would say is that the United States, the Kurds and the Kurdish officials understand that they are a NATO ally, but the United States must stop accommodating to Turkey and Erdogan. This has to be done. Erdogan realizes that the U.S. is weaker, that the U.S.'s reaction is very much slow. Erdogan realizes what happened when the Kurds called for a referendum in Iraqi Kurdistan, September 25th, and what happened almost less than a month after, in October 16th, when the Shiite militias, aided by Iran, funded by Iran, pushed into Kirkuk and other Kurdish-held territories. The U.S. reaction, they sided with the central government. The central government in Iraq is predominantly funded and backed by Iran and the mullahs of Iran. So Erdogan realizes that this may be the same situation in Syria, that the U.S. will just betray the Kurds once again, and he's taking advantage of this. Hence, that's why he is pushing forward with his aggressive rhetoric. We also have to recognize that Turkey is not a democracy. Turkey has never been a democracy in the eyes of Kurds, although other states might have had better relations throughout time with them, depending on who's ruling. But Turkey has never been a democracy. Turkey has always pushed forward a Turkishness inside Turkey. To if you're not Turkish blood, or if you're not Turkish, simple as that, or if you do not acknowledge to the Turkish way of life, that you are a threat. That's why he killed 1.5 million. That's why Turkey committed genocide against 1.5 million Armenians, because they stood up to Turkey's aggression then. And the Kurds throughout have faced this destruction. So if we realize that Turkey is not a democracy, if the United States stands up to Turkey, despite them being a NATO ally, I strongly believe that NATO will follow the United States' lead, because U.S. is the strongest military power in NATO, not Turkey. Thank you, Sarah, for the great question. I think the issue with Turkey, NATO, and the United States, and Turkey being part of NATO, this issue is long overdue. Erdogan has been in power since, 2001, 2002. He portrayed a peaceful image of himself, and up until democracy didn't work as he said, he got off the bus and provided another form of government, and this is a Islamo-fascist dictatorship inside Turkey. There certainly has to be a mechanism within NATO to eject and kick out Turkey out of NATO. The main reason that Turkey is still in NATO for the United States, and the strongest reason, is that the United States is using Incirlik base, situated in the southeast. Now, Incirlik, sure, that's a strategic base, and the United States has used that throughout, 2003 Iraq War, and I believe they used it in the Gulf War as well, the first Gulf War. But Incirlik is not the only base in the Middle East, and it's not the safest actually for the U.S. forces and U.S. personnel either. Germany realized this. Germany also was using Incirlik military base, but they moved out. I believe it was 2017. They moved out of Incirlik and moved to Jordan. So long past overdue. The United States has to take the lead. I don't think NATO has the appetite for kicking a member state out, unfortunately. I do agree that there has to be a mechanism inside NATO to either suspend, or I would prefer eject and kick out NATO. But the United States has to take the lead, as they are the biggest funder of NATO and also the strongest military power. So the United States has already, for a long time, before the invasion of Afrin, has paid strong attention to Turkey and given Turkey the benefit of the doubt. They've publicly stated that they understand Turkey's security concerns. They've publicly stated that they've even acknowledged that, okay, we realize that the PKK is a terrorist organization, and but what this has done, this has only given ammo to Turkey. So if the United States realizes our security concern, if I was Turkey, if they realize our security concerns, if the United States realizes, okay, there might be a PKK threat, which there isn't from Afrin, then we could use this to legitimize our invasion into Afrin. And of course, the ISIS war is still going on, which the United States is using as a reason to stay inside Syria. We can use that, put that in there too. The United States owes the Kurds a big backing, I would say. They have to protect the Kurds. The Kurds have always looked up to the United States and Western powers for support. And because the Kurds are naturally Western-oriented and Western-minded, and they believe in the democracy and pluralism, and where they can live with one another, and they're not expansionists either. The Kurds, that's very important. The Kurds do not want anybody's land, but they will not give their land to anybody, which is why they decided to resist and not give into Putin's deal and Assad's deal and Turkish invasion. So the United States can definitely do a lot. They can negotiate with Turkey, discuss the issue, but the first thing that must be done is to pressure Turkey to stop the air bombardment, because this is only hurting the civilian population. Turkey is flying way up high in the sky because it's afraid to fly too low that the Kurds might use their weapons to shoot down their jets. This is hurting civilians. This is hurting internally displaced people that have already been internally displaced from Idlib and Aleppo and other regions. Definitely, and I agree. And this is an act of war because Turkey has, Erdogan has publicly stated just a few days before the invasion of Afrin that he will strangle and bury not only the Kurds but anyone who is aligned with them. Who is aligned with the Kurds is the United States. That means he has threatened to attack U.S. military forces, U.S. military bases, and U.S. military outposts. And it was Erdogan's media, Anadolu Agency, who has who made a press article or something that showed showed all the military bases of not only the U.S. but the French outposts inside Syria. This hurt their situation. This affected their strategic military plans inside Syria. So Erdogan is not working with the United States. U.S. should not work with Turkey if it's behaving this way. And we continue, the United States, unfortunately, is lacking and continue to accommodate to Turkey while the Kurds are being used and abused for against Erdogan. And the Kurds want more than just fighting. The Kurds want to end to war. And the Kurds, yes, they're strong fighters, but they also want to live in peace as well. But I have to say that if the United States doesn't react and the United States doesn't respond to Erdogan, that the Kurds will keep resisting in Afrin. Yep, definitely. Great question. So I mentioned Afrin is separated from the rest of where the Kurds control the majority of their territories. The nearest point closest to Afrin, where it's Kurdish-held territory, is Manbij, and it goes all the way, and that region, and that starts from Manbij and all the way from to eastern Euphrates. So that is separate. It's kind of an island. It's on the eastern side of Afrin. It's controlled by Turkish military who have already occupied and annexed Syrian land. From the south, it's FSA and Al-Qaeda affiliates, and from another corner, it's Assad regime. And all in all, the airspace is controlled by Russia. So Afrin is surrounded. It was unable to connect with the rest of the Kurdish-held territories, and which is why it makes it difficult for the U.S. to react and respond. It's because there's no U.S. presence there. There's no U.S. Straightforward. There's no U.S. interest in Afrin because there's no military bases. There's no personnel. There's no forces there. So Afrin was seen as the weakest spot and the perfect location to attack and start this invasion, and then continue on if the United States doesn't respond across to Manbij, which is not that far, and continue down the Euphrates Valley. Russia has always been after its own interests in Syria, and the Kurds realize this. The Kurds realize that Russia is protecting its port there in Latakia and its bases there. Russia has no appetite for any crisis. They're not going to get involved. If there's no strategic Russian interest, why should they get involved? So the Kurds do feel betrayed. Now the Kurds have, throughout the not only the Syrian civil war, but the war against ISIS, have played all their cards. They've sided with the Russians. They've made deals with the United States because they realize that the United States will not have our back 100%. Russia will not have our back 100%. So we have no choice but to make deals with both sides. And their distrust between these two nations is showing in Afrin because Russia proved that it's not a reliable partner. It withdrew its forces before the invasion. It had troops inside Afrin. It withdrew its forces from Afrin, gave permission to Turkey, and then Turkey took it from there. And Russia's interest is basically to continue the Assad regime in the region. internal Kurdish politics is the biggest, I would say, the biggest obstacle to a Kurdish state. And I've always said this, and these states realize this: Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Turkey have realized that the best tactic and the best tool to use against Kurds from ever achieving an independent Kurdish state is to divide and conquer them. Unfortunately, we saw this with the Kurdish referendum that just occurred in 2017, September 25th, that the Kurds were not united. So therefore, if they were not united, if their house was not in order, if they did not have a united Peshmerga force, a military force, but rather they had a force under one family, the Barzani family, and another force under the Talabani family, the surrounding regions took advantage of this and pushed them away from each other, and ended up in the loss of Kirkuk, the historical Kurdish territory, and the Kurds call Kirkuk our Jerusalem, just as the Jews and Israelis call Jerusalem, their capital. We lost Kirkuk in result of a dispute within the internal Kurdish politics. We lost half of Kurdish territory in Iraqi Kurdistan that was gained by the Peshmerga forces who have fought against ISIS. We lost border posts. We lost airspaces. The airports were closed. So the people are suffering because of internal Kurdish politics. But this is all up to the Kurdish people, I think. The Kurds have to realize that as long as you continue to follow a leadership that pushes an agenda of a foreign power, you'll never achieve statehood. I would love that desk. But Israel has always been a partner of the Kurds. This was proven during the Kurdish referendum. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu came out in public, and other Israeli officials came out and opened in supporting the Kurdish referendum. They were the only country in the world to support them publicly, even though it's a double-edged sword, not only for the Israelis, but for the Kurds as well, because we're surrounded by Islamic regimes. And for Israel, it looks like in the Middle East, if they attempt to support a Kurdish state, it looks like this is some sort of a project by the Israelis. I would say that I would continue to push the officials in the Israeli government and any Israeli to voice their concern over Afrin publicly. And this because this is not only a Kurdish issue. This is a humanitarian issue as well. And it's an obligation to protect the Kurds, who have always been partners of the Israelis, and throughout we have a deep history with the Jews, and Kurdistan has had a lot of a strong Kurdish Jewish population, and they were forced to leave the country in 1950 after the creation of the State of Israel. And there's also over 200,000 Kurdish Jews inside Israel too. So you're not only fulfilling the demands of your own population, the 200,000 Kurdish Jews, but also you're backing your Kurdish allies, and who are no different than the Kurds anywhere else. They want a state of their own, they want a safe haven, and they just want to live in peace. And Erdogan is not an Israeli ally as well. My response to that, I mean, it's difficult to answer that question. I don't think it's as safe as it would be before Erdogan, and before, especially after Erdogan's rhetoric has changed toward more of a Islamic type regime. So I would not go to Turkey, but that's up on you. I'm sorry, I don't know how to answer that question.
Right.
No, I understand.
Yeah, the State Department would have better information on that.
Yeah, the State Department's website suggests that you don't go there.
There you go.